Before heading to the video, if you haven't subscribed the channel, do subscribe it and don't forget to click the bell icon for the latest update notification. If you like the video, do like, comment and share. Happy learning!
All right. So we're talking about descriptive statistics. And we said that, there are two ways in which we can describe any data that we're looking at. We said that there are measures for central tendency and then there are measures for dispersion. Now, among the measures for central tendency that we studied, we talked about mean, we talked about median, and we talked about mode. We said that mean is a simple average. Median is the 50th percentile value, which means it's the middle value in the distribution. And mode very simply is a frequency count, and the modal class that has the maximum frequency becomes the class that has the maximum frequency becomes the modal class or the mode. There can be more than one modes in a distribution, but then mode is simply that point in any distribution that has maximum frequency. Now we studied mean and median together. We said that mean can be better when there are no abnormal data points in the data. Why do I say this? I say that if you're looking at the mean of, say, some values like this, mean is a point estimate that you observe out of these values. Let's say this is your population. Mean is an estimate that you create out of this distribution by using all the values in your distribution. So you use all the values in the distribution, you take a sum of all of those values and you divide by the total number of values. So this is an estimate, or the mean estimate is drawn from all values in a population, as compared to which a median estimate is something that only looks at what's at the 50th percentile point, what's in the exact middle of the data. It does not care about how spread out the data is around it, or the measure for median can in no way give you a sense of whether the data set that you're working with is values that are close to each other or are values that are spread out. The simple reason for that is median only uses the middle value. In this case, let's say this data is actually sorted. So this point and this point become the points that are valid or important for this analysis. You compute a mean of this to get the median value. Now this median value does not care about what's on the left, what's on the right. Whereas mean is a number that cares about every number in the distribution before it gives you a point estimate of that particular population. Which is why when you don't have abnormal data in your distribution, mean can be a very good measure for central tendency. If you've got abnormal data points, so suddenly what I do is I change this 18 to 1800. If I change this 18 to 1800, which is something that I've not expected, then my mean suddenly shows that fluctuation. Why? Because mean is a measure for central tendency that is sensitive to values that are abnormal or values that lie in the extreme fringes of my distribution. So suddenly my mean value is going to shoot up. But because median does not use all values, so what we are picturing as a shortcoming of the median metric now comes out as something that brings it strongly outside, brings it strongly ahead of the mean metric, because it does not care about what's present around the fringes. It only cares about what's present in the middle. Median is undisturbed by any kind of abnormal data, which we're soon going to start calling outliers. So any kind of outliers that exist in the data, median is not sensitive to that. So when you've got outliers in your data, median is a smarter central tendency estimate if you know that your data more or less lies in a range that is acceptable and understandable. Mean is a better estimate, because mean is an estimate that is going to use every point in my distribution to ultimately calculate an estimate. So my estimate in some way and not in some way. An average is simply a equal weighted average. So every point in the distribution gets an equal weight when you're doing a simple average. And that's what a mean is. So when you're computing a mean, it's an estimate that's driven out of every point in my distribution as compared to a median estimate, which is only driven by points that are right in the middle of the distribution. So it could be, a distribution where the middle point is 10 and it goes up to minus 10,000 on one side and 10 to the power 6 on other side, versus a distribution which centers at 10, goes down to 3 and goes down to 12. The measure median is not going to be able to differentiate between these two scenarios. Do you get my point? The measure median will not care whether these distributions are this different. For both these distributions, if 10 is at the middle, it's going to call it the median. And we'll think that's a central tendency measure. For this distribution, 10 might be a very good central tendency measure. But for this distribution, it's not. Very simply because it does not use all the points in the distribution to calculate a metric. In this situation, mean might be a much better indicator of what your distribution looks like. Does this idea make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And mode we've already talked about. Mode we said is only just a frequency distribution, and the point that comes out most frequently is called the model class in a data set. So having talked about measures for central tendency, we then said that we've got to augment what we are doing with central tendency with something. That something turned out to be dispersion. So we can differentiate between certain kinds of scenarios. And for that, let's come back to an example. So you've got one class and you've got another class B here. Let's say this time it's a test out of 20 and there are 7 students again. Class A is like this: 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 and 13. And the other class is like this: 1, 2, 3, 10, 17, 18 and 19. Let's say these are 2 classes. If you look at these 2 classes carefully, if you think about mean, the mean of class A is what? It's 10. Mean of class B is what? That is also 10. You do that calculation, I think it will come out to exactly this value. If you look at the median, again, it's 10 for both. So again, this is one of those scenarios where mean and median both indicate that the distributions are alike. It's the same distribution actually. It's always mandatory to sort the data before calculating mean. No, it's always mandatory to sort the data before calculating median. When you're calculating median, then you've got to sort the data. Yeah, correct. For mean, you don't need to sort. For mean, you just got to sum up all the values in the population that you're looking at and divide by the total count of the population. How many people are there in the population? That's a mean. A median is simply sorting everything in ascending order. Whatever comes at the 50th percent point, that's the point that matters. Okay, so looking at mean and median, both these classes are indifferent, but a simple 2-second look at these numbers will tell me that these are not classes that are similar to each other. Class A is definitely different from class B. So we then moved on to augment the idea of the central tendency measure, because just the central tendency measure, as it quite clearly seems here, has led us down a dark path. We can see that class A and class B are different, but our central tendency measures say otherwise, and we can't do anything to refute that, which is why we are now augmenting our learning with something else that works very well in conjunction with measures of central tendency, and that's measures for dispersion that allow you to study that, okay, this is a central tendency estimate for this population, but then how different are the different points or the entire gamut of points that are available in a population, how different are they from the central tendency estimate? So that's the idea that we're trying to bring out. The first measure that works in that direction is that of range. We talked about this briefly yesterday. Range is simply max minus min. So in both these cases, if we do it, in this case, range is 13 minus 7, that's 6. In this case, it's 19 minus 1, that's 18. So if you look at range, you've got class A at 6 and class B at 18. Now this is the first place where, we get some sort of support statistically that these classes are different. And what it says is, although that both of them have a mean of 10, the range of values in class A is only 6, whereas that in class B is 18, which automatically indicates to me that class B has much higher variability as compared to class A. Class A seems to be much closer together. All the 7 people have gotten marks in the range of 6 numbers, which is a decently small range in a range of 20, as compared to what is happening in class B, where people have gotten it in the range of 18, which is almost as high as it can get. So range is one measure that allows you to understand dispersion. But the problem with range is that it does not really use the entire data very well. It just looks at the maximum value, it looks at the minimum value, and then it gives you a judgment on how variant the class is. The problem is, again, this is highly sensitive to abnormal data. Look at a distribution like this. Let's say there's a distribution like this: 7, 8, 9, 10, 9, 11, and 12. Let's say this is a distribution. We're looking at this distribution. If somebody asks or asks me to find out the range of this distribution, or the range of values that I'm seeing in this distribution, what's the range that I see? It's 12 minus 7, and that's a range of 5. Now right now the range of this distribution is 5. I suddenly change one value and I change that value to minus 40. The moment I do that, my range has now increased to minus 52. Not minus 52, 52. My range has now increased to 52. So again, like the mean value, range tries to develop an estimate for dispersion or spread. But the problem with this estimate is it's again very susceptible to abnormal data points, because it cares about the maximum value and the minimum value. And if there are values around the fringes that are way off the mark, those will be the ones that will be called minimum and maximum. And then in that case, that directly has an impact of the kind of estimate that we are going to get. So range is, again, it's a good metric. It allowed us to separate between class A and class B, but we need to understand what its challenge is. The challenge is, because it's working with the minimum and the maximum value, these are values that are present at the extreme fringe of our distribution on both sides. So because it's present around the fringes, there's a good chance that if the values that are abnormal in nature, we're going to get insane values for range. So that's one idea. And that's the first measure for dispersion that we've studied. We'll go to the second version, which is interquartile range. Okay. So interquartile range is hoping to be an improvement upon the range metric. And a common, problem or challenge that people saw with range was that it worked with min and max, which were extreme values. The problem with what happened in the previous case was not just that. It was also that even though if I remove minus 40 from this distribution, the rest of the distribution, which is, let's say, 85% of the data right now, it could be 90% of the data. The rest of the distribution is quite close knit together. It's still in a range of just 4. But just one value has completely screwed up my analysis of this particular distribution. Let's say there were 7,000 values and one value made the range horrible. And unfortunately, because of that one value, now the way you read the range metric for your particular distribution is very bad, and you don't want that. And that's one of the major challenges or claims that people are making, saying that range is not useful because it uses values that are present at the extreme fringe. They don't really care about how the distribution is doing, but it's just really caring about what are the ends of the distribution looking like, which was a common claim that a lot of people made. In an interest to remove that problem, people came up with the idea of interquartile range. What's interquartile range? To understand interquartile range, we'll discuss a few terms, which is any distribution can be divided into its quantiles. What are quantiles? Quantiles are basically the 25th percentile value, the 50th percentile value, and the 75th percentile value in a distribution. Sorry. This is called Q1. This is called what? Median. 50th percentile value is my median, and this is called Q3. Q1 is also called the lower quantile in some cases. Q3 is also called the higher quantile in some cases. You understand this idea. We already talked about what percentiles are. Percentiles simply indicate 25th percentile value means that point in the distribution, 1/4 of the points in the 1/4 of the total number of points are on the left of that point, and 3/4 of the total number of points on the right of it. Likewise, for 75th percentile value, 3/4 are on the left, 1/4 is on the right. So you first calculate these three values for your distribution. You find out the median. You already know how to find out a median. Now, we can also very easily find out the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile value by sorting the distribution and then looking at that 25th percentile, 50th and 75th percentile value. Once we get the lower and the upper quartile, interquartile range or IQR suggests that this should be equal to Q3 minus Q1. So it looks at the 75th percentile value and looks at the 25th percentile value and finds out a range of this. This range is IQR. It basically gives you the quantile range. Now first, what's the theoretical justification for something like this? The theoretical justification lies in the challenge that existed with range. When we are looking at range, and this was, let's say, my distribution, the problem that people cited was that because you're working with these bottom feeders, the points that are present at the extreme fringe, you're not really telling me exactly what's the nature of things that lie in the middle. You know, what most of the distribution looks like can get impacted by just a very few number of points that are, you know, extremely out of range but are present in the distribution. Just those few points will screw up my entire analysis when I'm looking at range, because I'm looking at the extreme fringe data. So what statisticians said is that, okay, do not look at the min and the max value. Look at the middle 50% of the data. What's the middle 50%? The middle 50% is the range between Q1 and Q3, because this is the 25th percentile value. This is the 75th percentile value. In the middle, you've got 50% of the total number of points in the distribution. So they said that if you want to find out a sense of range, don't do that for the min and max. Do that for the quantiles, or the upper and the lower quartile, because that range gives you a sense of where your 50% of the middle data lies. So in the absolute middle of the distribution, 50% of your data lies in what range? That's an analysis that's resistant to abnormal data points being present around the edges of the distribution, because it does not care about that. It only cares about the 25th percent and the 75th percent point. And then by finding out a range, you get a sense of how spread out the distribution is, at least around the middle. You don't get too much of a sense of how spread out it is around the edges, which means that if you compare your range and IQR, that will help you do that. But IQR very simply allows you to understand your distribution a little better, and it allows you to understand specifically the middle part of your distribution, which you're more concerned with, because that's the bulk of your data, and that's where you hope to, you know, do most of your analysis with. Does that make sense? The difference between IQR and range, and how IQR is better in what way?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if you go back to my example that we're working with, so class A and class B, can you guys quickly find out the IQR for both these groups? How do you find out the IQR? What's the median value here? The median value is this. Now what do we need? Now we need the 25th and the 50th percent, 75th. This is the 50th. If this is the 50th, means half of the data is here, 3 points, half of the data is here, 3 points. If I further break this down into half, then that becomes my what percentile? 25th percentile. If I break down, this is 50%, this blue range is 50% of my data. If I break it in half, I get my 25th percentile point. And where do I break it in half? It gets broken here. Likewise, in this bunch, I break it here. So this becomes my Q1. This becomes my Q3. Same for here. This becomes Q1. This becomes Q3.
6 and 16.
Yes, perfect. So if we look at IQR, then I've got class A that has an IQR of 4, and I've got a class B that has an IQR of 16. Yes. Now again, like range did, this again gives us a sense that class B is much more spread out as compared to class A. And we are able to reduce the range a little bit because we are now not looking at the fringes of the distribution. We are looking at the middle 50%. We're looking at the 25th percentile value and the 75th percentile value. Because we've got so few points, the range and the IQR are very close to each other. But ideally, IQR allows us to look at the middle 50%, whereas range sort of works with the extreme fringes of the distribution. But then these are two measures of dispersion that we've now discussed, which is range and IQR. But both of these have a similar problem. Both of these ideas of dispersion. Now, what have we discussed? We said that dispersion, or what's the idea of dispersion? Why do we calculate dispersion? The idea of dispersion is to all right. Okay. So we're talking about dispersion. Now, what did we say about dispersion? We said that dispersion, what we are trying to do with dispersion is understand how different points in distribution are different from central tendency estimate. Now that's the purpose of talking about dispersion. The purpose of talking about dispersion is you already figured out a central tendency estimate. You want to understand how different my points in the distribution are from that central tendency estimate. I want to get an estimate of that variability, and that variability that we capture helps us understand the variance or dispersion or spread, whatever you might want to call it, but it helps us understand the dispersion in the data. Now in that direction, we've studied two approaches right now. We've talked about range, and then we talk about IQR. The problem with both these approaches is both of them use 2 points. Range uses min and max, IQR uses Q1 and Q3. Here you're using min and max. Here you're using Q1 and Q3. Using just 2 points, you're getting a sense of how different the distribution is from the central tendency. Good enough, fair enough. We do not have anything, so it's something is better than nothing. But the problem is we want to understand how different every point in the distribution is from the central tendency measure, not just 2 points. Or we don't want to create an estimate for dispersion by looking at just 2 points in the distribution. I want to be able to create a measure that is able to go through every point and study how different it is from each other, and then be able to create a metric. That's my premise under which I'm trying to work, and I'm trying to create a measure for dispersion that stands up to this yardstick. Now, in that direction, 2 new measures came out, not actually 2, there's one measure which we call variance. And they realize that the real difference that you're looking to see is not, you've got to be able to quantify what variability or what difference you're trying to find in the data. And for that, central tendency estimates come in useful, because you try and study variance from central tendency estimate, how different every point in my distribution is from the central tendency estimate, because that helps you create a benchmark that will now allow you to get a sense of variability or dispersion in your data. Which brings us to the idea of variance. Now, this idea that we are talking about, we'll first try and understand what variance exactly is. Fundamentally, this is the mathematical formula, xi minus mu whole square by n, where mu is the mean of the population. You're simply going to look at one data set and we'll compute our variance. So let's look at class A. So class A had 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 and 13. These are the marks that kids got. Now, the concept of variance, what it tries to do is, it tries to understand how different every point in the distribution is from the measure for central tendency. Here, this is your xi. We'll quickly write out what x bar is, and x bar is 10. It is 10 throughout the distribution. So the first thing that it asks you to do is find out xi minus x bar. And that's what? Minus 3, minus 2, minus 1, 0, 1, 2, and 3. Xi minus x bar is what? This is difference from mean. With central tendency, what were we trying to capture? We are trying to capture how different every point in the distribution is from the central tendency measure, which in this case is the mean. Now we've actually found that out. We found out how different every point in the distribution is, how different 7 is from 10, how different 8 is from 10. Likewise, for every point in the distribution, we figured out how different every point in the distribution is from that, from the measure for central tendency, which is mean in this case. Now the second step is to be able to estimate, get an estimate of this. The simplest idea that comes to head is what? Compute an average of this quantity. Can we do that? Right now, xi minus x bar, the idea makes sense, right? That's the measure for dispersion that we are hoping to calculate. How different a point is from the central tendency measure. Now that we found that out, should we take a simple average of this quantity and go ahead? The answer to that is actually no. The reason why that is because when you actually take a simple average, you add 3, or let's say you add minus 1 and 1, and that becomes 0, correct? Which means that 9 was different from 10 by minus 1, 11 was different from 10 by 1. When both of them add up, that creates the total difference, or the total difference comes out as 0. Basically, you're sort of normalizing the difference here, which you don't want to do. 9 is as different from 10 as 11 is, just that they're different from 10 in opposite directions. But here direction does not matter. The concept of dispersion or the concept of variance has nothing to do with direction. It does not care about direction. What it cares about is that a number is different from a certain other number. That certain other number is the mean in this case. And we're trying to look at every point in the distribution and try and find out how different they are from that mean. Now, whether 9 is different from 10, absolutely it is. It is different because it's 1 unit less. 11 is different from 10 just by the same amount. It does not matter in what direction it's different. It's just the magnitude that matters. And that's the problem that we are hoping to avoid, because when we actually add up all these terms in this case all actually add up to 0. And you're going to get a total difference from mean as 0, which is not the case. There are numbers that are actually different from the mean value. So this is the problem that we come across. This cannot be done. Now people are trying to solve this problem. How to solve this problem where these positive and negative differences are actually normalizing each other out, which brought them to an interesting idea and a mathematical trick where they said that let's not look at it like this. Let's do xi minus x bar whole square. Let's square every number. What that will do is it will now give me a new distribution, which is 9, 4, 1, 0, 1, 4, and 9. Now, based on this metric, now we've created a new index to study difference from mean. Right now, we're using xi minus x bar, which is straightforward, which comes to our head directly. Now, we've slightly altered it. We're looking at the square of that number. What that does for us is minus 3 and 3 were treated as different things. But 7 is just as different from 10 as 13 is from 10. They're 3 units different from 10. Does not matter in which direction they're different, but they're 3 units different from 10. Therefore, this difference and this difference should be treated similarly. In this case, xi minus x bar, it's not being treated similarly. It's being treated as 3 and minus 3. When they add up, it becomes 0, which does not make sense. Whereas when you look at this metric, there they're both being treated as 9, which means that it's the same thing. You get my point? So we solve that problem of having positive and negative differences looking different from each other. We've solved that problem by basically squaring every difference. By squaring every difference, we've now gotten numbers that are very much readable. Now I'm going to compute a mean of this quantity. When I compute a mean of this quantity, that's going to be 9 plus 4, 13, 14, 2 is a 28, 28 by 6. That's going to be 4.64 somewhere. Sorry. Absolutely. It should be 7. So that gives me 4. So the variance of this data set is 4. Another metric that's a derived metric out of the same metric is standard deviation. It's simply the under root of variance. And here in this case, it's 2. Because our variance is 4, the under root of variance will then come out as 2. But you need to get this idea. What's the idea? The idea is very simple. We are trying to estimate how different every term in my distribution is from a measure for central tendency. In that respect, we've selected mean as the measure. We're looking at mean. We're trying to find out the difference from mean. When we look at the difference from mean, we realize that there's a problem of positive and negative differences and them being treated differently from each other. Because we've simply computed a subtraction between the number and the mean value of the distribution, we're sometimes getting positive values and sometimes getting negative values, which will normalize each other out if we compute a simple mean right at that point. Now to solve that problem, we basically take squares of those numbers, which normalizes the negative and the positive sign. And then we take a mean of that quantity to get variance in a squared scale. Right now, the actual variance is in a scale of 3 units, 2 units, 1 unit. But then when we actually compute a mean, we compute a mean in a squared scale. These numbers are squared and we're looking at variances at a squared scale. Therefore, we've created a new metric, which is standard deviation, which is simply under root of variance, and it brings down the variability inside the distribution to the scale of the distribution itself. So by doing this under root 4, we bring it back to 2. And we can quite clearly see that on an average, the difference between values is close to 2. Does this idea make sense of standard deviation and variance? How they're useful, how they're calculated, what's the intuition behind these terms? When I've got a term like xi minus mu, this has positive, this has positive and negative values. Now to solve this problem, what we did was we did xi minus mu whole square, squaring to eliminate sign. Now why not do mod of xi minus mu? Why not take a modulus of this quantity instead of taking a square of this quantity? Because modulus of modulus of this quantity will solve the problem as well. The modulus function is defined as mod x is equal to x when x is greater than 0 and minus x when x is less than 0. So no matter what the number, modulus of that number is always going to be a positive number. So instead of taking squares and then taking a square root again to find out standard deviation and bring it back to the scale of the distribution, why go to all of this hassle? Why not just do a mod of x? That's a very good question actually. The problem is that this question was asked close to 100 years ago. 100 years ago, things weren't as simple as it is right now. Now at this point, maths, computation, everything is very easy for us. 100 years back, it was not the case. They were faced with the same challenge. They wanted to solve this positive and negative problem. And there's a nice story around this actually. So it's good that you asked this. There's a nice story. There were two scientists. One of them, it was Gauss, and the other one was Laplace. Have you heard of both these people? Gauss, I'm sure some of you must have heard. Have you heard of Gauss?
Gauss value, something
This
like
was Frederick Carl Gauss.
Yes.
One of his greatest and popular discoveries was, sum of natural numbers. 1 plus 2 plus 3 up to n is n plus 1 by 2. Then 1 square plus 2 square up to n square is n plus 1, 2n plus 1 by 6. And then for cubes also. Do you remember these formulas? These formulas are taught to every kid, right? You remember these formulas? 1 plus 2 plus 3 up to n natural numbers. What's the sum of these numbers? Gets calculated by n plus 1 by 2. And then you got squares, then you got cubes. So this person discovered these formulas. And guess at what age did he do it? A wild guess. He did it at the age of 5. He found out these formulas, discovered these formulas at the age of 5. So, so genius. So he was a brilliant guy. He has a lot of other contributions to maths also. This is just a folk story, so no need to worry about it too much. But a brilliant guy, When we studied about him, I was quite mesmerized when I learned about this person. So this is one of those guys, and the other guy is Laplace. Anybody who's done any intermediate level physics will have heard of Laplace. Even chemistry, people would have heard of Laplace. So there are several equations that are attributed to these scientists. So Gauss and Laplace were two famous people that were working on the same problem contemporarily at the same time. And they came up with two solutions. So Gauss suggested variance squaring. Laplace suggested absolute value. Both of these scientists made these suggestions, and they had to actually defend these suggestions, that why these are better ways of solving the same problem. Now this absolute value approach gives you a number which is called MAD. It's called mean absolute deviation. So basically compute mod of xi minus mu by n. This is MAD. All right, back to the story. So both of them had to defend their solutions. One of them had suggested squaring. Laplace had suggested absolute value. The problem was, this person was suggesting a function which was y is equal to x square. This person was suggesting y is equal to mod x. Now these calculations were very important, but this is not the only context in which this conversation was happening. Now, these calculations were very important where they had to solve optimization problems at some point. Optimization problems. And the only tool that they had to do it was calculus. Calculus was the only way that you could solve optimization problems by finding maxima, local maxima, and local minima. But the problem is, any kind of maxima minima solution, any kind of optimization solution that you do through calculus, to find whether at any given point a curve has a maxima or it has a minima or not. See, a maxima or a minima basically is an optimization exercise. Even in data science, we'll realize that most of our models at the end of the day are running an optimization exercise. Way back then, when they were talking about this problem, they knew that ultimately they had to propose something where they would be able to do some sort of optimization. We'll very soon realize that when we study linear regression, because that's again directly a place where this problem comes out. And you had to suggest a function that we could easily find optimums for, a optima, a minima, or a maxima. Now for that to happen, a function needs to be differentiable. Function must be differentiable, which means that you should be able to differentiate that function. Now, if you look at the two graphs or the two functions that we're talking about, if you look at the two functions that we're talking of, one function that we've spoken of looks like this. This is y is equal to x square. The other function that we are just talking of looks like this. This function that you are looking at, this is y is equal to mod x. The problem with these two functions is, now let's say this is your 0 and the curve is touching right at that point. This is what it looks like. The problem with this is, at x is equal to 0, y is equal to mod x has a sharp turn. It suddenly changes slope. At this point, y is equal to mod x was like this, sloped like this. Now suddenly it's become sloped like this. Now any curve that suddenly changes its slope is not differentiable at that point, which means that y is equal to mod x is not differentiable at x is equal to 0, whereas y is equal to x square is a smooth curve, which means that it was differentiable. And for this very simple reason, that the function that Gauss was suggesting was a differentiable function, which means that if you had to run any kind of an optimization exercise on it, you could simply do the calculus, differentiate, find out the inflection point, find out the critical points, and find out what the maxima or the minima is. As compared to which, if you're using y is equal to mod x, which Laplace had suggested, you wouldn't be able to differentiate that function. Now this is when science was way back 100 years ago. And at that point, y is equal to mod x was a function that was not easy to deal with. It was a non-differentiable function at x is equal to 0, and people found it difficult to work with. Now at this point, that's not the case, which is why machine learning engineers, you will see 90% of them prefer MAD over variance. Something that was proposed around the same time but completely lost significance, people forgot about it, has now become very significant, and a lot of people are talking about MAD. And mean absolute deviation is now becoming a metric that allows you to do a lot of studies across sciences. At least in data science, it's become heavily used. Up to this point, people are working with variance and standard deviation as the only measures that could be used. But now part of that problem is solved to an extent. Now you've got mean absolute deviation, which is being heavily used by ML engineers across different places. We'll see these applications in other algorithms as well. But then that's the long but interesting explanation to why you don't use a modulus. That answers your question, right? But this is good piece of information to know about. Why we don't use modulus? You very well can. Unfortunately, at the time when this problem was being solved, at that point, y is equal to mod x was not a feasible function to use, which is why Gauss's idea became very popular and Laplace's idea, people forgot. And that happens every time in science. So people forgot about that and did not use it very much. But like naturally you came to that conclusion, you felt that modulus could also be an option, and it very well, it very much actually is. In fact, there can be arguments made in favor of mean absolute deviation as compared to variance. There can actually be arguments made in that way. Can you think of an argument? Okay, let's think of an argument. If you understood this completely, then think of a scenario in which mean absolute deviation is better than variance. If you haven't understood anything, let's talk about it. Correct. I think you've gotten the idea. The idea is that of squaring, inflating the proportion of something that is already there. So what happens is, let's say this is a distribution and I'm computing variance. Variance, I think we've already computed right now for this distribution. We found that variance is 4, standard deviation is 2, and we know that this is what the data looks like. If I suddenly, also let's calculate the MAD. MAD in this case was how much? It was 3, 2, 5, 6, 12 by 7. MAD was 12 by 7. So that's what? 1, 7, 1.7. Now let's say I suddenly change one of my data points to 70. If I suddenly change one of my data points to 70, Now my distance from mean gets calculated as -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, and 60. As far as MAD is concerned, what's my new MAD value? My new MAD value is 6,
But
9,
the
69.
mean will change, right? Mean will
Oh,
not
sorry.
be 10 anymore.
Sorry. Yes, that's true. Let's say I change that to 70. Up to this point is, sorry, not 70 exactly. This is 20, this is 20, 40, 50, 57. This would become 60.
18 point something, 18.57.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want something like that. I want 83. If I put this as 83, do I get my mean as 20? This is 57, 140, right? Get my
That's
mean
true.
as 20, right?
Yeah.
So my mean now becomes 20. Let's look at the difference. -13, -12, -11, -8, 63. Now, if you look at the MAD of this case, the mean absolute deviation will be a number that's in a range that is absolutely acceptable. It sort of, we know that, a fluctuation has happened, which is why my mean values, MAD values, all of these numbers will change. But here the change is 13 plus 12, that's 25, 36, 46, 55, 63,
18.
plus 63. So 126. 126 by 7.
It is 18.
18. All right. So the MAD has now changed to 18. But if you actually think about what happens to standard deviation gets heavily impacted because this number is going to now get squared. The problem with the approach of squaring is that the reason why squaring 1 was because squaring was an easy function to work with. It was differentiable and it was easy, and that is why it became popular. But the same squaring, which made it easy for people to use it, makes it complicated to handle abnormal data. Whenever you got abnormal data points in your data, a few bad values, a few values that are sort of extreme, when they get squared, that problem gets further complicated. A large number multiplied by a large number is an even large number, which means that you're complicating, you're sort of amplifying your problem more and more because of the squaring step that is done in between. Even though you're going to take an under root after that, but because you've done a squaring, you've sort of increased the magnitude of the problem by a large amount, as a result of which your standard deviation will see a heavy fluctuation. And that's for the simple reason that we are actually squaring the change before we actually take the mean of it. Now, the concept of squaring, anywhere and whenever it gets used, you always have to be careful about abnormal values or extreme values being present in your distribution, because the presence of extreme values will mean that the problem will get compounded the moment you square anything during the process. So there's several things like distance-based measures that people use in several algorithms, and wherever an algorithm uses a distance-based measure, which basically does a square of certain quantities, you've got to be very careful about abnormal data points being present in the data. So the problem with standard deviation can be brought out in scenarios when you've got some changes that are huge, some points in the distribution that are hugely different from what they originally were, and that's going to cause problems for the analysis. Does that make sense? And that's where MAD is slightly better. MAD is a little more resistant to it because it does not square the error. Once you start squaring the dispersion, that's when the problem starts, because that's where you're compounding the problem. If you don't square it, which is what happens inside mean absolute deviation, it remains at the scale at which it is, which is why it does not have as much of an impact as it does on standard deviation. Does that make sense? ठीक है. I think Now that's the conversation on measures for central tendency and some measures for dispersion that we did. We talked about 4 measures for dispersion. We found out when and where they are individually useful. What are some use cases in which some of the measures become extremely useful. Talked about the differences in the context of range and IQR. We've talked about the difference in the context of MED and standard deviation. All right, we'll now move on to the next idea, which is sort of a closely related idea, which is the next summary statistic that we will talk about. It's called a 5-point summary. Now, statistics offers us a collection of 5 data points that help you understand the data in a very crisp way. You know, you've got any data set that you're working with. If you really want to understand it well, statistics allows us or helps us out with a tool which helps us calculate a 5-point summary of the data. That's very useful. Now, this 5-point summary is nothing but 5 data points that are calculated for any numerical series. Looking at those 5 data points, there's a lot that you'll be able to infer about that population. There's a lot that you'll be able to talk about it. So you're going to talk about that 5-point summary. The first is, what are the points that are represented in a 5-point summary? You've got the minimum value, you've got the maximum value. Just a second. All right, you got your min value, your max value, you got your Q1 value, your Q3 value, and your median value. We've already read about all of this, what this is. The min and the max we already know. Both of these can be used to immediately find the range. The Q1 and the Q3 value, these can be immediately used to find the IQR, the interquartile range. This is the upper quartile, the lower quartile Q1, and Q3 is the upper quartile. Median in itself is a central tendency measure. But there's a lot that you can say about your data given that you have this information. The moment you know what the min and the max value, you know what's the total range in which a particular column lies. So you know the range of your data set. Once you're able to find out the 25th quantile, 50th and the 75th quantile value, that further helps you differentiate or segregate between the middle 50%, the left 25% and the right 25%, or it helps you differentiate between different sections of your population. Also, it gives you a sense of the interquartile range, which is the distance between Q3 and Q1. The idea of discussing this separately is because this 5-point summary is something that we can get almost instantly on Python by using a method which is called the describe method. But what describe does in addition to it is that it does not provide a 5-point summary. It provides a 6-point summary. It gives you one additional point over this. And what's that additional point? That additional point is the mean. So instead of just giving you these 5 points, what a describe method will do on Python is it gives you a 6-point summary. It gives you the min, max, the Q1, median and the Q3 value, but it also gives you the mean value. Now, in conjunction, all of these points will help you get a very detailed understanding of your distribution. It helps us first understand the data better. It also helps us visualize it in our heads.
Rahul, it gives count also.
The describe method does, yeah. Describe method that gives the count also. We are talking about the statistical terms that come out of a 6-point summary. So describe method will give you count. I think describe method, if I remember correctly, it also, no, it's just the count, right? So it's the count and these 6 things. We commonly call it a 6-point summary. That's why we generally talk about only the 6 points. Count is also an additional point, but not treated as a statistical fact. Now there's a visual representation of this 5-point summary as well, and you have most likely heard of that representation. It's called a box and whisker plot. You've heard of this? You've drawn this
Yes.
box plot. Now box plot has at least 200 implementations in Python in different kinds of modules. In all kinds of modules you'll see implementations for box plot, but I like the Seaborn version the best. The Seaborn version is the best for me. We'll talk about a box plot. Box plot exactly does what the 5-point summary does. A box plot will typically look somewhat like this. Point like this. So this is your minimum value. This is Q1. This is median. This is Q3. And this is the max value. Now, this is how a box plot typically looks like. Now this range, which is Q3 minus Q1, is the IQR, the interquartile range. The minimum value is the smallest value, the maximum value is the largest value in my distribution. And this is a good visual way of representing the same facts that we learned using a 5-point summary. Here we don't have the mean, that's why it's not a 6-point summary, because we only have the median and the other 4 points. It's a 5-point summary. This is how it's represented. Now this is also used as an approach to identify outliers in our data sets, but we'll not discuss about it right now. Right now what I want you to do is solve a small example. The example is like this. I'm going to give you a set of numbers. 34, 18. I want you to find out a 5-point summary for this. This is the distribution. Let's quickly find out the 5-point summary. This is just to ensure that you're comfortable with the idea.
Should we do this in Python or just?
Just as a pen and paper, not Python.
Okay. Okay.
Python, so we might directly have a function to do this. I'm just trying to, do a little hands-on so that you never forget these ideas. Three minutes. You got 3 minutes to do this. I'll just ask for the answers in 3 minutes. Okay, we'll move on then. I think the values are right. Nobody disagrees. So let's move on. Okay, I think every page is getting used. Let's take a wipe. But we'll now actually look at a scenario. The scenario is simple. There are two companies. Company A how to calculate Q1 and Q3. Q1 is the 25th percentile value. Q3 is the 75th percentile value. 25th percentile value, how will you find? In this case, you got to first sort out the data. The data is like this: 18. Can somebody read out the sorted data to me? 27. Then you have 34.
52.
52.
52, 54,
52, 54,
59,
59, 61,
68,
68,
87,
87,
93 and 100.
93 and 100. Perfect. How many terms do we have here? That's the first.
11.
There are 11 terms, so that's brilliant for us. So we'll look at the fifth term now, sixth term. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this becomes my median automatically because there are 5 points to the right of it, 5 points to the left of it. Now in the left there are 5 points, in the right there are 5 points. Within these 5 points I want to find the middle point. That's this point. So this becomes my Q1. Why is this the middle point? Because 2 points to the left, 2 points to the right. Similarly here 87 is my Q3 because 2 points to the left, 2 points to the right. So I know what my Q1 and Q3 is. Is that okay? Perfect. Okay, now there are two companies. Company A is a toy manufacturer. And they produce kits for kids, toy manufacturer for kids. Then there's company A, company B. Which is creating a drug that cures diabetes. And just like how the real world works, the CEOs are friends. CEOs of both these companies are friends. One of the companies is toy manufacturer for kids. The other company is a medical company which produces a drug that promises to cure cancer, cure diabetes. Now, in this context, both of them have come up with a survey that needs to get conducted for their businesses. Fortunately, the kind of demographic information that they're looking to collect are similar, both of these companies. And because the CEOs are friends, they've decided to collude on this and basically do the survey together. So you go out to a ad agency and they ask them to do a survey for them. First of all, should they do something like this? Is this a wise choice to do a survey together? It's the same kind of demographic factors that they're wanting to get data on in a given community. They've got different products that they're selling, but the data that they need is for the same kind, is of the same structure, similar columns. So is it a good practice to, do the survey together, both of them? Hire the same agency, do one survey, both of them use it. Is it a good idea to do it?
No, right?
Why not?
Because those companies are like different in every aspect.
Okay. Why? Me and you are very different. Me and you might be different in all aspects, yet both of us might love cornitos.
I think they can do it because when they go on survey and they reach out the family definitely have kids and elders. They can do the job in one shot.
They can?
They can do the job in one survey. Like when they reach out family to find out the kids and what they like, and when they reach out the family at the same family, and they can reach out to the elders and they can find out what the problem they have.
Perfect. Actually, your answer has solved a few questions that I was going to ask later on. So it's a very good answer, actually.
But Rahul, what about the family if they don't have the kids and the person and the family itself has the diabetes? So in that cases, that survey will not be feasible. I mean, like that survey will not be applicable.
Those families also matter, at least for the diabetes drug manufacturer. So why is it not feasible? It's possible that, you go to some houses where you don't get data for both products. In some houses, you only get data for one of the companies. the relevant data for only one of the companies. See, the idea here is for you to identify that, it's not just because that they're doing different things that they need to do surveys separately. The idea is that they need to target a very different class of people. These people have to survey kids. These people have to survey older people. So the target group for both of these surveys is completely different. That's one problem. But like you pointed out, that problem can easily be solved by going to families. If you're going to families, then most likely, those families will have kids. So you get both target markets. So one part of the family you are interviewing for the survey that you're doing for one of the companies, the other part for the other part, because you're getting a collection of both target groups of people in the same place, that makes your job a little easier, and that's why you can do it. Otherwise, fundamentally, you should have parted ways, because you are both targeting a very different kind of audience. If I come back with a survey and you look at the age column, and this is one good use case for a box plot. Let's say I draw a box plot of all my numerical columns. One of the columns is age. In the box plot, I realize that Q1 is 2 and Q3 is 8, max is 45. Even though max is 45, if my 75% of the data is less than 8 years old, then I automatically know that this survey is useless if I'm a drug manufacturer. This survey is perfect for the toy manufacturer, but for a drug manufacturer, this survey is worthless. Now, immediately by looking at just one plot, you are able to disregard a survey altogether. So it's a huge piece of decision that you are able to take by looking at just one metric. Now, that's the point that I'm trying to make, that by looking at just the 5-point summary of any numerical column, there's a lot that you can say about that data set, whether that data set is good for you or not, whether that data set contains the right kind of people for your analysis. Let's say you're targeting above 50 people and you do an analysis of teenagers, you do a survey of teenagers, and that's what the age column indicates to you, then you know that the data set is wasted. It's not a good data set for you. But this kind of insight you get immediately by looking at a 5-point summary, as compared to you having done a lot of analysis and ultimately realized that data was not right for it. Does that make sense?
Rahul, sir, actually, I didn't understand your point. So you are telling it is correct or not?
Correct or not? What is correct or not?
Means those company A and company B doing survey together is a good thing or not?
It could be, because you've got, the way you're going to target audience. If you're going to, let's say, go out to families inside apartments. So that, these apartments only have families. They're no bachelors. You go to families. When you go to families, that there's a good chance that you'll get some elderly people and some kids. So because you're going to get a fair distribution of both kinds of people that you're looking to target for both the companies separately at the same place, there's a good chance that a survey can be conducted together. And that's why there's an okay chance that something like this has happened. Otherwise, they should have parted ways immediately the moment they realize that they've got completely different target groups that they're hoping to survey. It's much better to do independent surveys. But because getting to such, because the groups of people are such that you can get to families and in an apartment, or if it is a possibility, then it's okay. Otherwise, you must go other ways, because the target groups are so different that the same the same survey or the same data cannot be good for both these companies. If the data is good for one company, it's going to be bad for the other company. So you've got to be careful when you're doing surveys in this kind of a way. See, the idea is to be simply careful with, in this scenario, what kind of sample are you trying to create? And where you can get a sense of what kind of sample you've created is by looking at things like 6-point summaries, 5-point summaries, and other descriptive statistics about columns. That's the idea. Is that okay?